It's a first go. So can you tell us about your older relations in Germany then? Tell us about a bit of family history from Germany. Your parents and their parents.
My father was born in Zerbst. Zerbst is the town where Catherine the Great comes from.
Yes.
And his father, who died very young, worked on something to do with law.
What was his name?
Ernst.
Ernst Fritzer.
Ernst Fritzer, and his mother's name was Betta. Now, I don't know an awful lot about my father's father, with other words, my grandfather, other than that he had a brother who went to America with a cinema and went bankrupt. My grandfather stood for it and lost his money as well.
Right.
His brother promised to make sure he gets it all paid back again. We haven't heard from them ever since.
Right.
Now that must have been about 1910, because it was before the First World War that he went to America with this like a tent-like cinema, and
what, for like travelling around, pitching up a tent and showing
films. Yeah. Well, there were some pictures about at one stage. It showed this cinema and, very old-fashioned thing. My father was potty on aeroplanes. My grandmother, I understood there must have been an insurance of some sort, because she didn't work. She did some embroidery, but whether that was for other people or for herself, I'm not sure.
Well, the photographs from those days seem to show a fairly well-to-do family.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that there are photographs suggests they were quite well-to-do.
They were very fond of their garden. They had a lot of pictures of the garden, with the garden house, which wasn't where they lived. It was a complex of gardens, and families met there quite frequently on Sundays, by the looks of it.
Yes.
My grandmother I never met, because she died a year before I was born. She had a gallstone and she died in the operating theatre. My father was brought up by our Aunt Lizzie. Our Aunt Lizzie was the daughter of my grandmother's sister, Maria. But she was out of wedlock, and the father drowned himself in the
What's in the Elbe?
No, not in the Elbe, in the Weser, not far from Hameln. Because we took Lizzie to Hameln, and she said, "Oh, that's where my papa drowned himself."
Oh, right.
So the family, this father's family, looked after Lizzie while she was young and sent her to a Montessori school of some sort, where she learned to look after children and teach children. And she actually brought up my father. Those two never actually separated again. he got a teaching, and whenever my mother was first, Aunt Lizzie grumbled. She was number one. My mother's father comes from a mining family. Iron ore, that was sort of north of the Harz Mountains.
Where is that in relation to Zerbst?
A long way away, considerably distance
Right.
away. Sort of Magdeburg was halfway. Why we landed, or why we started in Magdeburg, the only real knowledge I have is that Lizzie married very late and had a flat in Magdeburg. And when my grandmother died, my father's mother died, she went and lived in Zerbst and left my father the flat in Magdeburg. They swapped.
Oh, right.
Because Junkers had started developing in Magdeburg. They developed the motors, and father was involved in that. How and when, I'm not sure. All I know is that somebody told me years and years ago, oh, we went to Munich. We went to the Museum of Aeroplanes, and your father's signature is on one of the motors.
Yeah. So, if your mother came from a long way away in the Harz Mountains, how did she come to meet your father?
Well, no, by then my grandfather, who incidentally was called Krüger, when he got married, they moved to Magdeburg, and he worked for the railway in Magdeburg. There was Kruppgrusung and all heavy industry there, and he was involved in the railway systems of some sort. My grandmother also comes from that area. She married very young. She was only 17 or 18 when they got married. My mother was born in 1907. My grandfather was born in 1880. I know that, and because Lizzie was also born in 1880. I can't remember offhand when my grandparents, the other grandparents, were born. The war came. By then my mother was born, and my mother had a sister, Gertrude. And my grandmother had to go and work in the munition factory. Sort of replay of what's been happening in England, of women who didn't have the vote, but they were used to work, replace the men who went to war. My grandfather came back from the war stiff, and they had arthritis.
Which grandfather do we mean?
Mother's father.
What was he doing in the war? Was he in the army?
He was in the army. He also had an Iron Cross.
Do you know where he was fighting?
I think it was the Somme. I'm not sure, but he didn't talk a lot about it. I mean, my grandfather was a great storyteller, but he didn't tell us much about the war.
No.
He was disabled, totally disabled. He was totally stiff by the time he got home, and never went back to work again.
What, was he sort of injured
No, the arthritis must have been from the trenches. Made him totally stiff. I mean, he couldn't bend his fingers. His hands were,
right.
Like this. But he also had psoriasis very, very badly. We found out later that it was sort of an inherited factor from his mother, from his mother's side. My mother learned a trade in selling linen and clothes and haberdashery. It was a proper sort of job.
She worked in a shop, or
She worked in a shop, and she had actually
in Magdeburg.
In Magdeburg, she had to provide knowledge on how to serve customers and all sorts of things. It was a proper do. She was always slightly angry at my aunt, her sister, because her sister learned childcare. She had a proper job.
Well, the childcare was a proper job, or the...
Well, yes, it was childcare in such as daycare.
And that was considered to be a better job than...
yeah. She also went to a middle school. My mother went to an ordinary school. Simply because initially my grandparents didn't have the money to send on, but somehow they found the money. My grandfather was one of 4. My grandmother was one of 5. My grandmother's family all moved to Magdeburg. My mother had several uncles there and an aunt. And we were actually quite connected with my grandmother's family.
Mm.
My grandfather's mother lived also in Magdeburg eventually. Now she had money, how we don't know, because I talked to one of my cousins a little while ago. She had a posh flat and posh furniture, and all the family dues happened around her until she died. I must have been about 10 or 11 when she died.
Presumably some of the Kruger side of the family stayed in the Harz Mountains, did they?
Yes, yeah.
And that's why you've got the connections with the Harz Mountains, is it? Because you speak about them a lot.
Yes and no. Because towards the end of the war, my grandparents evacuated back to the Harz Mountains, because they lived very close to Gruzon, which was a munition factory and armaments and whatever. And it was only a matter of time that it would be destroyed.
Yeah.
We lived very close. So lived 2 brothers of Omi. We called my grandmother Omi. All in the same road, more or less. Why we went to the Harz Mountain was something totally different. Father worked for Junkers. Junkers went underground in the north of the Harz Mountain. And Mother was the social worker there. She was responsible for all the families whose husbands were drafted or had been killed. And in 1944, in September, we moved. No, we didn't move with a removal van. We moved by train in baskets and suitcases. And one of the incidents was that I'd gone by myself. Must remember I was 15 at the time, to get some more stuff. And so I packed 4 suitcases, 2 carrier bags, one a standard lamp, and in the shade I put mother's hats, because in those days you wore hats.
Yeah.
And I had a little sort of trolley type thing, but it had wooden wheels. Now we didn't live all that far from the main station, about a quarter of an hour's walk, but I knew I had to catch a train in the morning, because train travel was restricted quite considerably. So I toddled, and these things kept on slipping and sliding, and on the way there, a bloke with a horse and cart came. He said, "You want a lift?" So I said, "Yes, please." So I got a lift to the station. Got to the platform. Well, there'd been a air raid again, and the train was going to a different platform. So I had to take all these 4 things and 5 things and 6 things and 7 things downstairs, next floor, flight up. And as I was getting there, the bloke was whistling with how it was going, and there stood a few people there, all in posh uniforms, and they said, "What, you want to go in this train?" "Yes." "Right." So somebody opened the door, somebody threw me in, and then everything just fell in.
Right.
I sort of stood there, it was packed. I stood there, and then I opened my eyes, and everybody had us, because it was 2 people, 2 benches opposite one another, everybody had something of mine on their lap. Well, I was going through the Harz Mountains to avoid being in open country, because we had quite, in those days we had a lot of bombing. And so I changed in Gernrode into the Harz train. Now that's a little way to find things like it is forbidden to pick flowers while on this train. It's just puff, 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 puff train. I got to the inside of the Harz Mountains, had to change there, everything in and out and in and out. And then I got to a town called Nordhausen. And that's where my parents worked.
Yeah.
Well, I then had to go and find the train which took me to the place we were living in, Zorge, which was where we lived for quite a while afterwards. So again, all my luggage to another platform. I sat there, and then they turned up. After all this, we got to Zorge, and the cart broke. I got it all the way there, but then it broke. So that was that. So that's something, you sort of never forget.
No.
I don't know how we did it. We went to Magdeburg once more, and the whole night we carried stuff to the station. What we wanted to take with us, because we had nothing when we moved first. My father stayed in a hotel for a while, and we managed to get home without any incidents. And on the 13th of January, Magdeburg was flagged. And there was nothing left, not very much left from what we had.
But your old flat still standing today?
Yeah, it's still standing, but there wasn't much left initially. my grandfather, after the war, managed to get some beds out. There were still beds there and bits and pieces. But Magdeburg was really destroyed, particularly where Junkers used to be. Now, where Junkers used to be was also the home of my best friend. They had a vinegar and mustard factory, and there was very little left afterwards. There were also relatives living not far from there. A sister of my grandmother was living there. She then moved into my grandmother's flat. My grandmother then was able to get back my grandfather into their own home. That sort of is that. We experienced the end of the war in Zorge, and we were captured, if you might call it captured, by the Americans. Now we'd left the house we were in a couple of nights before they came, because there was an aeroplane, a Fieseler, which is one of those aeroplanes which just buzzes about and takes pictures.
Yeah.
So we decided we better leave there, because they had a headquarter there. There was officers and wireless and everything else. They'd settled themselves into where we lived. We decided we better leave. What we didn't know was that we were actually going towards the fighting lines and not away from the fighting lines. And we managed to clamber up some steep slope, and my father had pneumonia at the time as well. And then it went pshee, pshee, and they were shooting right over our heads. So we went down again, and that in the dark. But the Harz Mountains are a beautiful bit of countryside, and we've been walking quite a bit. We always used to walk, so we had some idea where we were. Anyway, we started to fight. They started fighting again. We realised we were between the lines, so we made our way back home again, and they were absolutely amazed when we came to the German side that we were still there, because they were all old men now left.
Yeah.
With those things you shoot at panzers or at tanks. You shoot from under your arm. There was, I don't know what they were called. They had a little warhead, and then they had a tube, and you were supposed to be shooting those at the tanks.
Right, I know what you mean.
We had one more night, and then the Americans came, and obviously they were interested in my father. But he was so ill by then that they realised there wasn't much they could get out of him. And also there were some Italian soldiers who'd, why they were there nobody knows, but they were taking the interest away from us.
Well, whose side were they on then? If they were in Germany, were they were Italian soldiers?
The Italians were half and half, weren't they? They were on the German side.
They started on the German side, but then with...
But anyway, they were downstairs in the garden running around like headless chicken, and the Americans decided they were going to have a look at them. And that was that. Now, they then erected barriers, and you had to have a pass. Zorge is a village which is one long street, but sort of 3-4 miles long, except for the centre where there were some houses on the left and some houses on the right, but otherwise it was just one long, and obviously sloping as well, because it was, it was quite hilly there.
Mm.
So every, don't know how many meters, there was a barrier, and you had to have a passport for that. So we had to get get a passport, and it was most uncomfortable because there they were walking with their guns, and I was 16 at the time, and I felt very uncomfortable. So we had these passports, and we had to have pictures. And then we had curfew after 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or whatever, we had to be home. And that lasted for a few weeks, and then the British came, because it became British territory. And that wasn't too bad. I can remember them, because we were the very last house up the hill. They used to stop there because it was beautiful there, and used to boil their kettle and make tea and offer us tea and biscuits.
So they were quite friendly then?
They were very friendly. There was no problem there whatsoever. But it was occupation, there was no two ways about it. And then of course there was no food. And that village didn't lend itself to growing anything. Before the war, everybody had a cow, and the cow would be, before the end of the war, during the war, well, all the time actually, they had the cow in a cart, when somebody used to go and pick them all up and take them into the mountains where there was food and grass and things like that. They were okay, they had some milk. They could feed their cow, but we didn't have that, where you had to queue for 2 hours for 50 grams of salt. Food was extremely short, and we picked plants we could eat and made spinach of it, and we had milk because we had friends who would give us a quantity of milk, so we had milk, and we used to make bread with maize flour, which we got, and you had to eat it the same day because otherwise it went rotten. We were very hungry. In fact, I passed out a couple of times because I was so hungry. School had got finished by then, and also we then realised that the Russians were coming, and we would be inside the British territory. But all the rest, all that, when I went to school, and it became occupied by the Russians.
After the war, did that area become part of East Germany then?
It was East Germany.
Even though the British were sitting in that little bit where you were?
Yeah. They quickly erected wires, so you couldn't get there anymore. People still crossed, got caught and sent back home again. My grandparents visited my mother and father.
Which ones we're talking about?
My mother's father and
Yeah.
mother came to visit my mother and father. They crossed the border. And there's a picture, a couple of pictures actually. And that must have been 47, possibly 48. And then they shut the doors completely, you couldn't get through. Now, my mother, by then I started secondary education, but my mother insisted that I went for something or other over to where Lizzie lived and where my grandparents lived, and somebody was taking my passport to Berlin, because you could get to Berlin because there was the corridor of the trains which take you to Berlin, and Magdeburg was halfway. They stopped, but they never picked anybody up. So a friend of ours took my passport to Berlin and made out I was in Berlin, but I was in East Germany. Another incident. Lizzie decided we were going to Quedlinburg, which was a town a little way away from Bauenstedt, where Lizzie lived. And we went, and somebody dropped a purse and screamed, "Somebody's stolen my purse." Everybody together, where is that purse? Me without a passport.
Yeah.
Well, the purse was found just in time. So I decided I don't go shopping with Lizzie anymore. Anyway, so there was still a way of keeping connected. And then the wall was built, and then it was, of course, there was no way you could cross unless you had all the papers you needed. Now, the last time I went with papers to East Germany was when my grandfather and my aunt died within days of one another. And I went to the funeral. Coming back, I had a pair of shoes in there which were a bit painful, and I hadn't worn them. Some policeman opened my bag, saw those shoes and said, "They hurt you. Let me have them." I said, "No way, they don't hurt me." But every bit was searched. That was the last time I went by train, before I got married. But there are all sorts of little snippets of what can happen to you and what has happened to you. I don't know what you want to know now.
Will you tell us a bit more about your mother and father and how they met?
My mother had a friend and they went to the theatre. Magdeburg had two theatres. One was where you found drama and opera, and one where you found light opera and all the other bits and pieces.
More musical sort of thing.
Yes. Maskenblau, all sorts of... Anyway, she'd been with this friend to the theatre, and so had my father with a friend. My mother was 16. And they hooked up. It was all very proper, and there was no hanky-panky in those days. My father by then was living in Magdeburg, but his mother was still alive. She died in 28, and my father was totally helpless, so my mother decided to marry him. So.
What did your father do for a living in those early days?
Well, he was working for Junkers most of the time. Again, sort of looking forward.
Are we talking 1920s he was working for Junkers?
He was working from the time he left school, and he was 18. He trained, but he also was involved with gliders, because in those days aeroplanes weren't allowed to be built up just after the First War, weren't rebuilt. Yet Junkers somehow managed to develop aeroplanes, and funnily enough I found a bit of paper the other day. Junkers was very well known as civil aircraft. But there was a feud between Hermann Göring and Junkers, and Junkers died in very strange circumstances. I didn't know this until a couple of years, maybe 3 years ago, when I found an article in the paper which confirmed, Messerschmitt and all the other plane manufacturers contributed something after the war, but Junkers never picked itself up again, and I couldn't understand that. But of course, he was dead. He wasn't there. There wasn't anybody there to pick up what was left of it. So it all disintegrated totally. But of course, they also built the Stuka.
Mm. What did your father do for Junkers? Was he?
Well, he was supervising, testing. He also had the chance to test an aeroplane. But I think all the... I'm not sure exactly what happened, what he did, until he took on leisure for the workers.
Mm. That was during the war.
That was during the war. But he's never worked anywhere else. It was Junkers all the time.
And he had an accident, a flying accident.
Gliding accident, yes, which haunted him for the rest of his life. They weren't allowed to have aeroplanes which had engines, but they were allowed gliders. And there's a very famous place in Germany called the Rhön, Wasserkuppe, and that's where they sort of had contests in gliding. And he came down while the sun, for whatever reason, and damaged himself.
What did he do to himself?
Something with his stomach. I don't know, because years later he had to have some operation.
Because he lived to a ripe old age, didn't he? So, but I remember he used to take lots of pills before all his meals. Was that anything to do with that?
Quite possibly, it's had something to do with it. But that was his life. That was his life.
So what did he do? Did he put him in hospital for a while when he had the accident?
I have no idea. That was before he was married.
Right.
I have no idea. But in those days there was still the old-fashioned gentry about, and they were able to indulge themselves in this sort of thing, and father was mingling with them, whatever. There were lots of medals he'd had, but what happened to them, I don't know.
Mm.
My mother was the one who kept the family together. She was a strong woman. My father was pretty softy when crisis came. His mother who got us over the end of the war. And then father had to, because he'd been in the Nazi party, he had to do what he was told, and he had to fell trees for years and years and years.
To fell trees?
Fell trees in the Harz Mountain. Until he decided he had enough, and then he sold books, and then eventually he became an insurance, or whatever you call it.
What, an insurance salesman?
Salesman. For a firm called Iduna, which got him to Hanover. From Torre to Hanover.
Oh right. So when would they? You'd have already come to this country when they
Yes.
moved to Hanover.
Yes.
So what were they? When would they have moved to Hanover?
50. I came in 51, so it must have been 52.
Did they go straight to the flat in Rangbergstrasse?
No, they didn't. They had a room first, and then there was some, because they'd lost their home, there was some compensation if you contributed that to.
What? They lost their home in
Yeah.
Magdeburg.
If you contributed this, what you, the state or the government were paying you, you contributed it to any other building, and you had a flat, and that's how they got to Rangbergstrasse as a compensation for losing their home in Magdeburg. And it was a reasonable.
Was Rangbergstrasse built after the war, or was it already
Yes.
there?
And,
So it was a new flat they moved
it was
into.
a new street, more or less, apart from the corner house and the odd house in between. And Hanover was flat as well. So what next?
Do you want to stop there? That seemed
Yeah.
quite a lot, didn't it? We stop there for now.